Joining me now in the center ring is executive editor at SCOTUSblog.com, Zachary Shemtob. Welcome, Zachary.
Glad to be here.
Thanks so much for coming on the show. And it's a fascinating subject that seems to be catching fire lately. But let's go back to the beginning with the Founding Fathers. What were they thinking with respect to lifetime appointments for the Supreme Court?
So as we know, the Founding Fathers were all over the place on different issues. But on this, it was pretty clear that they supported lifetime tenure to make the court as nonpartisan, non-political as possible. And we know this from Hamilton, Alexander Hamilton, and Federalist Paper number 78, where he wrote that this would lead to greater impartiality among the justices or judges in general. And the idea there was if someone has served a life term, as opposed to having to worry about being reappointed or even elected, they were less likely to be biased towards political parties or factions, and therefore would be more of an independent actor than if they had to be, again, reappointed or elected.
So let's follow this string before we run a couple other questions. Do you have any examples over the years where Supreme Court justices appointed by one party really disappointed the party that appointed them?
Oh, there are plenty of examples. I mean, most recently is David Souter. Souter was appointed by George Bush and ultimately ended up being quite moderate to liberal, we would call it, later on in his tenure, and was a huge disappointment among conservatives. And there was lots of calls after that for no more Souters. Another example was Blackmun. Justice Blackmun was appointed by President Nixon, went on to write and be a huge part of Roe versus Wade, and was considered, ultimately a huge disappointment. Also came on to be virulently against the death penalty, became another cause of his. And so you had, a lot of disagreements there as well, and factions breaking down.
Well, it sounds like the idea of judicial independence works then with the lifetime appointments to that extent. But I want to go back to the actual composition of the court. It has 9 justices now. Was it always 9 justices?
It was not always justices. Actually, the Judiciary Act of 1789 set 6 justices. And just to rewind there a little, the Supreme Court, this Constitution itself, does not say how many justices there should be. It does not put any limit on that either way. And so that was established through statute. The first statute was the Judiciary Act of 1789, and this appointed 6 justices. The idea there was, at the time, Supreme Court justices did something called ride circuit, which meant that they appeared on the different circuit courts, and they literally had to travel around the country to do that. And at the time, you had 3 circuit courts, so you had them appear on 2, so you had 6 justices for the different circuit courts. So it was based on that, which is very different than today.
So that obviously changed to 9 at some point. What happened with it changing it to 9?
So a lot of things happened. It was changed a number of times. Proposals were between 5 and 10 justices, and it changed, periodically to a variety of different numbers. Eventually, it hit 9, I believe, in 1869 or thereabouts, and has stayed 9 since. Because what would happen is a political party would come in. They would want justices on their side. They would increase the amount of justices on the court. Those justices would then be appointed. The next political party would cut in. It would cut down on, they would then do the same, and you had retaliation back and forth. So eventually this came to an end in 1869, and there's been a detente since then. Well,
the detente hasn't been unbroken, though. Isn't it fair to say that President Roosevelt, during the New Deal legislation was trying to get passed and upheld by the Supreme Court, tried to pack the court in the 30s?
He did. He tried to pack it up to 15 justices.
And what was the idea behind that for him?
Well, the idea behind that was he said that 9 old men were blocking his New Deal legislation. Now, to be fair, most of the justices were not that old at the time, so this was exaggerated to begin with. But he claimed that he wasn't able to get past what he wanted to get past as long as these justices sat on the court, and therefore put forward the idea of appointing up to 15 of them, obviously putting in 6 justices who would be loyal to him and pass New Deal reform. The court behind the scenes, Charles Evans Hughes was Chief Justice at the time, and an ally of FDR, even though he lumped him in with the 9 old men, Louis Brandeis, Justice Brandeis, opposed these measures, as did a lot of Congress, and they were able to put the kibosh on them, and it was a rare political loss for Roosevelt.
Yeah, he got beat up pretty good with that one, if I recall.
He did. He did indeed.
So we still have 9 justices, but it's fair to say that in the last several presidential administrations, it seems like something's happened and there's been a shift politically in the Supreme Court. Could you point to what's causing this shift and what your take is?
Yeah, so I think it's really complicated. I would say the Supreme Court has always been political, in that you've had justices deciding based on, certain political considerations they have. And this goes on to the very beginning of the court. The idea of the court as apolitical is actually of relatively recent vintage. You had early on justices deciding based on, certain things which we would find actually highly inappropriate today. There's a difference between that, I think, and partisanship. And partisanship is the idea that justices are deciding based on the president of the political party which appoints them. So in the past, you saw more shifting, for better or worse, among justices who, as we talked about before, like Souter, Blackmun, Justice Kennedy, Justice O'Connor, would not necessarily decide based on what their parties, had necessarily expected. And again, we could go back and forth forever about whether, this is a good thing or bad thing, et cetera. But there's, I would say, more of this idea of partisanship on the court than there ever was before. And I think this is inflated as well by social media and the constant 24/7 monitoring of the court and turning everything political. So the general politicization of society itself, which, again, I think is a result of media and social media, has also hit the courts. And so now everything they do is put under a microscope and viewed through a partisan lens, which, regardless of how they decided, was not the case even 10, 15 years ago.
So because of all what you just laid out, there's been some proposals out there, one of which is term limits of some sort for Supreme Court justices. What have you heard about that?
I mean, what's funny about that is the term limits debate has been raging since the beginning of the court. If you go back to every era of the Supreme Court, different folks have proposed term limits. I believe Thomas Jefferson actually was one of the first people to propose term limits. He initially believed in lifetime tenure. Then there were a number of decisions that went against his agenda. And when he became president, he was suddenly was opposed to life tenure and supported term limits. In the 1830s and 40s, you had big debates on term limits. The idea of, this judicial oligarchy and term limits need to be put in place. 1890. So we've seen it again and again. And the latest iteration is to impose term limits. The proposal is usually 18-year terms. So each president would get to appoint 2 justices.
So when you say an 18-year term, why that's the reason? So every president can have a shot at appointments?
Exactly.
Okay.
It's to kind of make it as bipartisan as possible. It would be based on, if presidents from certain parties were elected over and over again, they would get to appoint more justices. But the idea is ultimately to allow the flexibility of each president to put in place, for their term, 2 justices. So that's what 18 years works out to. There's a bigger question about what to do if that was put in place with the justices now. Some say, they should slowly be replaced. Others should say, no, they should be allowed to serve until they retire or pass away. So there's an additional question there, and the scholars go back and forth.
Zachary, it seems like a lot of times the Supreme Court votes along party lines. That is, the party that appointed them is the one they vote with. Like now it's a 6-3 Republican-Democrat composition. Has that always been the case, that they generally vote along party lines, or are there exceptions as well?
I mean, there are certainly exceptions. In terms of voting along party lines, prior to the Roberts Court, you had a lot of 5-4 voting when it was, a 5-4 court. Now, that's complicated a little by Stevens, who was appointed by a Republican president, but voted, more liberally. But if you count Stevens as one of the liberals, then the court was certainly, in many ways very partisan. I think, or the idea of it was partisan. I think one of the big differences, if not the big difference, is that you had swing votes. So you had justices who were appointed by one party, but could either go, either way to the quote unquote liberal or conservative outcome. And that was Justice Kennedy, Justice O'Connor, et cetera. And now you don't have as much of a swing justice in that sense. But I don't think we should forget that one of the most quote unquote partisan decisions of all time occurred in Bush versus Gore in 2000. So, we have forgotten to a great extent how partisan that decision was. And when compared to today, in some ways, it may even be more so.
Zach Shemtob, thanks so much. It's been a great discussion.